The summit at the Joint Base in Anchorage, Alaska is our top focus story on this broadcast. So US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin, they met for close to 3 hours. It began with the red carpet being rolled out. There were smiles and there were handshakes. An unusually warm welcome by the US for an adversary. But what happened behind closed doors? The Ukraine war was discussed. When the two faced the press, of course, there was no deal, but no questions were taken either. There was conversation of understanding and, of course, a lot of praise for each other. But when they left, President Putin, just before that, he invited President Trump to Moscow. There's also this conversation, what happens next? President Trump, speaking to journalists later, said his meeting with President Putin was at 10 on 10. He said he wants the killings in Ukraine to stop, but warned it's not a done deal yet. Now the ball is in President Zelensky's court. So far the conversation was between the American president and the Russian president to take it forward. There are certain points that the Russian president has also put forward, and principal concern is Russia's key concerns on security. Their core concerns must be addressed. Now, there's going to be a meeting perhaps between President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin of Russia. The American president, he's told journalists that both sides want him to be there, so he will be there. President Putin is now back in to Russia, but President Trump will be calling up not just NATO leaders, but also President Zelensky to discuss the progress made. Let's listen in.
So, just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So we also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think, you know, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all, but we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax, but what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound. And I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Radcliffe. Thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job.
I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there was a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere.
И вот сегодня мы слышим, когда президент Трамп говорит, что если бы я был президентом, то войны бы не было. Я думаю, что так бы на самом деле и случилось. Я подтверждаю это, потому что в целом у нас с президентом Трампом наладился очень хороший деловой и доверительный контакт. И у меня есть все основания полагать, что, двигаясь по этому пути, мы можем дойти и чем быстрее, тем лучше, до завершения конфликта на Украине. Благодарю вас за внимание.
So the description was that the talks were held in a very positive environment. The Russian president wasn't just focusing on Ukraine. He was focusing on his core concerns, Russia's core concerns, also on business ties between America and Russia, which he said, since the new administration had come, had grown by 20% and should be higher to reach its potential, not just cooperation between Moscow and Washington, D.C., but the Russian Far East and the American West Coast and cooperation in space. Let me quickly bring in India Today's Rohit Sharma, our man in Washington, D.C., and Pranay Upadhyay, who joined me on this special broadcast. Also with me is Dr. Survo Kamal Datta, joining us as an analyst on this broadcast. But Rohit, to you first, what's the key takeaway in the United States of America? The fact that the two met, President Putin described President Trump as a dear neighbor, spoke of Anchorage, Alaska, where the meeting took place, the distance between the two countries, divided just by the Strait of Bearings is a couple of kilometers, 4 to 5 kilometers at the most there. But was there a meeting of the hearts and mind in that positive environment?
Well, look, I think there was a lot of flattery, Gaurav, I think, coming from President Putin. I mean, he said so many words. I mean, I think a lot of people were surprised that he started with the opening remarks. Usually, it's the host country leader that would start with the opening remarks. But it was, we saw them walk in and President Putin just started talking and started giving remarks, which was unusual for a lot of people. And then he started getting into, going about, how they both fought wars together, the US and the Russians. And there was this relationship right now probably was experiencing the lows of Cold War, and that he wants to turn a leaf and wants President Trump to know that he's interested in and invested in getting a ceasefire. And he used the word ceasefire, but a resolution to this war. So I think there was a lot of flattery, frankly. And he was, trying to be as nice as he could to President Trump. And I think he won diplomatically. I think he was first, this is his first time ever on the US side in the past 10 years. No, but not any other US president has invited him. So I think diplomatically, it's a huge win. He did not commit to any ceasefire. That's a huge win. The fact that he was able to bring in a business delegation and talk to President Trump for over 2.5 hours, including trying to convince the Americans to do business with and increase trade with the Americans is a big deal. As far as President Trump is concerned, I think he wanted some kind of a roadmap towards a ceasefire. And this is what he's been saying after the meeting, that yes, they've talked about it. They've talked about land. They've talked about other things. They've talked about NATO, and that he's going to be dialing up Zelensky and others in Europe to find out how that would pan out. And frankly, then going on Fox News saying the ball is in Zelensky's court, and he wants Zelensky to strike a deal with the Russians. So a lot that has to happen on the American side and European, and also including Zelensky's side. As far as I think Vladimir Putin is concerned, he did not concede anything. He walked in with the war raging, and he left with the war still intact and going on in Ukraine. So President Trump actually needs to find or at least sell his roadmap to Ukraine and to European partners and see what could become of it.
Indeed, and let me quickly bring in Pranay. Pranay, the kind of words that were used, flattery or great diplomacy, Trump, let's begin with what Trump said. Progress made, no deal till there's a deal, but I believe we had a very productive meeting, many points that we agreed on, and a couple of big points we haven't quite gotten there, but we're making headway. He didn't go into specifics, but the American media, Pranay, is quite describing this meeting as a big win for President Putin, as Rohit also put it. How would both sides look at it? A win-win, except for those who want the war to continue?
Before I answer your question, Gaurav, did you notice that what President Putin said? He said that there has been a 20% increase in bilateral trade.
Absolutely.
Since the Trump administration came. And, from our point of view, from the Indian point of view, this is an interesting and a very significant fact given by President Vladimir Putin from the US side. Now, coming back to your point, absolutely. President Putin, he has dealt various US presidents since Bill Clinton to Donald Trump in his second tenure. He knows how to deal. He gave President Donald Trump what he wanted to hear in terms of that this war would have not started in 2022 had Donald Trump would have been in White House. That he thinks that both big powers should decide, and President Donald Trump quite agreed on that thing. That was a departure that both sides agreed not to take any questions, to maintain the secrecy of the talks, to maintain that a lot of things need to go in before they announce, before any significant decision that comes on Russia-Ukraine front, because President Trump also indicated that now he's going to call various NATO leaders as well as the various partner countries, and also the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Definitely, in all likelihood, it was quite expected that the US media would term it. Even John Bolton, who worked as his NSA, he said that Putin won. Though Trump did not lose anything, but Putin definitely won.
What an interesting description by John Bolton. And I want to bring in Professor Andrew Latham, distinguished scholar of international security, strategic studies, and political economy, who joins us on this special broadcast. Professor Latham, welcome. Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, welcome. Dr. Surya Kamal Datta, welcome. Professor Latham, your appreciation of the meeting, you agree with John Bolton. President Putin won, though President Trump did not lose. Key takeaway according to you, sir?
Well, I think that's an apt way of characterizing it. Putin certainly won in the sense that he got literally and metaphorically the red carpet treatment. He's back at the center of the international community in his own mind, at least, and he certainly was treated that way. There was a lot of bonhomie between the two, and compliments were exchanged, and he looked like a world leader, not the isolated warmonger that he has been made out to be in certain quarters around the world. So in that sense, Putin definitely won. He also won in that he played defense very well. He didn't give anything up. He kept talking about the root causes of the war in Ukraine, and no ceasefire was possible until these were addressed. These are long-standing red lines for Putin, and he didn't back off them one little bit. He seems physically incapable of smiling, but again, metaphorically, he was smiling throughout this thing. He was on his best behavior. He looked like a statesman. He looked like the leader of a great power. That's a win for him. Trump, on the other hand, looked like what he is, which is a deal maker. He, again, emanated this very positive, gave off this very positive vibe. You know, but when you listen to them carefully, they said almost nothing. Generalities and vague aspirations, nice words, but no details. And then Trump dropped the big bomb at the end, near the end, when he said, "Well, of course, there was one big issue that we couldn't agree on." Well, gee, I wonder what that big issue was. It's clearly Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. A while back, I would have said that Donald Trump would have rolled over because he's not very interested in Ukraine. He's not very invested, again, literally or metaphorically, in Ukraine. And I don't think he cares very much. But he's under a great deal of pressure from American partners and allies. Prime Minister Starmer in the UK and Chancellor Merz in Germany and President Macron in France and others. And they are insisting that Zelensky has a seat at the table before any deal get done. And so Donald Trump, as is his wont, changed his mind and changed his approach.
Okay.
Bottom line, for this particular 3-hour-long summit, everybody looks like a winner, except for the Ukrainians.
That's the big point. Everyone looks like a winner except Ukraine and Europe. Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, you've served there extensively. Europe was very apprehensive that President Trump may concede, may force Ukraine to cede territory, even though indications were that territory swap or conceding territory would not be a part of the conversation on day one. But your takeaway from the 3-hour-long summit, sir?
Well, my takeaway is on a slightly different note.
Okay.
You know, President Trump's desire to bring the Russia-Ukraine war to an end is linked to his desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The Washington Post had commented last month that the road to President Donald Trump's highly coveted Nobel Peace Prize might ultimately run through Ukraine. Now, if you recall, in his inaugural address on January 20 this year, President Trump had said that his proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and a unifier.
Yes.
He has repeatedly said that this is the reputation he wanted recorded in these 3 books. And it's no secret that he covets the Nobel Peace Prize. Let me recall also that last month, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, had told reporters that it's well past time that President Trump was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war's complexity and the deeply entrenched positions of both sides, combined with the potential for shifts in the global political landscape, make ending the conflict a formidable challenge. So, what is Europe's take on this? Europe certainly doesn't want a settlement forced by the United States, and which is entirely against the interests of Ukraine and, in fact, of the whole of Europe. And it's not going to be able to, for President Trump to force a solution. And this is perhaps what has happened. Nothing major, I think, has been achieved. Though, of course, the White House had already tempered the expectations down. They had said it's a sounding out summit. But more than that, I don't think we can expect much from what happened.
Dr. Surva Kamal Datta, would European capitals heave a sigh of relief, or would they be disappointed with several commentators saying President Putin has walked away victorious. He hasn't conceded an inch. There is no ceasefire. The war continues, and he's got the red carpet.
Well, I would say Europe would be doubly cautious now after yesterday's and last night's meeting of President Trump and Vladimir Putin. I understand also that the biggest loser in this first round is actually Ukraine. Ukraine actually did not get what it was expecting. It was expecting an immediate ceasefire. President Trump was so shrill and loud before the meeting, saying that if there is no immediate ceasefire, he will just walk out of the meeting. And after the meeting, he sounded so hollow. So, and that is what the character of President Trump is all about. He keeps on fluctuating. He keeps on deviating from whatever he says. But the biggest winner out here, in my understanding, is like hats off to Russian diplomacy, as well as to President Vladimir Putin. He has personally won the first round. He has re-established himself, re-legitimized himself and his presence as a global leader, and especially with the Western Bloc. And what better than United States of America? Second is like in terms of the tariff also, I think President Trump has to give a lot of answers to the global world now after the explicits given by President Putin that, there has been a 20% increase in bilateral trade between United States of America as well as Russia after the new regime came over. So President Trump has to give a lot of answers to China as well as to India and other countries on whom he has imposed sanctions because of bilateral trade with Russia.
He's threatened 25% additional sanctions on India, chickened out of imposing additional sanctions on China for the next 90 days. But as you very rightly point out, that if there is a bilateral trade, and as President Putin mentioned, 20% it's reached, Professor Latham, this would put America on a sticky wicket because the world is watching this very, very closely. But I'll come to tariffs in just a moment. The meeting in Alaska, the fact that President Putin said we are close neighbors, though separated by the Strait of Bering, no summit for over 4 years, ties were at its lowest since the Cold War, and that's not good. But the point that he raised, Professor Latham, the fundamental threat to Russian security, that needs to be addressed. The people of Ukraine are brotherly. Events are tragedy and great pain even for Russia. Is that an indication that Russia is friendly with the people of Ukraine? It's the regime that President Putin wanted to paint in a corner.
I think that's the narrative that President Putin would like the world to buy. And it's not without historical justification. The borders are, as are all European borders, very artificial and product of history, product of war in the past, product in this case of Stalin simply arbitrarily redrawing the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union at one point in the 1950s and taking Crimea out of Russia and putting it in Ukraine quite arbitrarily. So there's that going on here. But there's a slightly bigger picture here as well, which is that the Europeans, I think, are exaggerating the Russian threat. I think after these 3 years of war, the Russian people and the Russian government and the Russian military have had enough. They're exhausted. It's not like they're going to get a ceasefire on their terms, favorable to Russia, in Ukraine, and then turn on Sweden or Poland or the Baltics. It seems inconceivable. And yet this is a very live fear in many European capitals, especially those that border on Russia. So it is a European issue in that respect, although it doesn't need to be. It could be treated as, here's the real problem. There are two issues, one of which is Russia's geopolitical imagination, which always includes Ukraine and Russia in the same political unit. But the other one, which people in Europe have ignored and have refused to face, is that as NATO has crept closer and closer and closer to Russia, Russian security anxieties have gone up and up and up, finally through the roof. And the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back was when the U.S. started talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO. That is intolerable from a national security perspective from Moscow's viewpoint. And so it's hardly surprising when you put those two things together, this imagined history, let's just call it that, of unity of these two peoples, plus the fear generated by NATO expansion and NATO expansion and NATO expansion, it's hardly surprising that Vladimir Putin lashed out the way he did. Lots of blame to go around here.
Indeed, and we will talk about who should shoulder that responsibility or be blamed for that bogey. President Trump did speak about another bogey. It's that Russian interference in American elections bogey, and he said that hoax kept that relationship from moving forward in his first term. And subsequently, President Putin spoke of the relationship being at its lowest during Biden era, which shouldn't have been. But Ambassador Dayal, before I bring in Rohit into this conversation, one, do you see the relationship move forward, or will there be an intense pushback from Europe and from Ukraine? How do you see Ukraine reacting to this? President Zelensky was, he kept tweeting till very late at night when this conversation was happening. No reaction just as yet. But would he heave a sigh of relief, or would he be very, very worried that he may just be hung out to dry?
As regards Ukraine's reaction, let me state that Zelensky had always totally rejected the idea of making any territorial concessions or ceding any territory.
Yes.
You'd recall that in a video address after President Trump had announced his forthcoming meeting with Putin, Zelensky had said that Ukraine is also ready to work together with President Trump, but he had vowed that his people will not give up their land to the occupier. And Zelensky had also said that any decisions which are against us, any decisions that are without Ukraine, are also decisions against peace. So he has been very consistent in making clear his opposition to this sort of meeting that was taking place between President Trump and President Putin. And the expectations in Europe were never very high. But of course, there was a degree of concern whether something could be worked out behind their backs. The fact of the matter is that this meeting has made it very clear that bringing about any kind of a ceasefire is going to be very, very difficult.
In a moment from now, I will put out those two images. In February, when President Zelensky had traveled to the United States of America, the treatment he got, almost maybe described as the belt treatment in the Oval Office, the manner in which President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance went after Zelensky, and the treatment and the red carpet that was rolled out for President Putin. But that story coming in just a moment. But there's breaking news coming in. President Donald Trump's big remark on India tariff, and this is a remark that he's made to the US media. President Trump has said maybe no secondary tariff for India. President Trump has said Russia lost a major oil client, that is India, because of his conversations. President Trump says India did 40% of oil trade with Russia, and now that's not happening. This is what President Trump has told the US media, and he's saying maybe there will not be the additional tariffs on India. Remember, President Trump had spoken of 25% additional tariffs on India that would come into effect if Russia-US talks collapse. That's point one. Point two, his Secretary Treasury had warned India of even more tariffs if the talks went downhill. The outcome of the Russia-America talks were to decide tariffs on India, which many in India, not the government officially, the government's been silent, many described was very arbitrary, analysts especially. But Rohit, that's a big statement that comes from the American president to the American media. Maybe no additional tariffs on India.
It is, Gaurav. I mean, I'll have to go back and check what he has said. I mean, what exact words he has said. I mean, there was some confusion about, was he talking about other countries? Was he including India or not? But if he specifically talked about India and no additional tariffs, I think that's a huge win. That's something, he said that after he announced those tariffs is when the Russians agreed to meet up with him in person. So if that's the case, if he's thinking about not putting those additional tariffs, I think that's a huge win. But I'll have to go back and check. President Trump could say things and obviously, walk back his comments or find a way out of them. But if that is what he has said, and if he's saying that he's not going to put any more additional tariffs of India, definitely, something good that came out from the Alaska summit.
Okay. Professor Latham, in your appreciation, Were there grounds for Russia to threaten India with additional tariffs for Russian oil, or was it just a maximalist position that America had taken just to perhaps get a better trade deal? And in your appreciation, did that backfire, sir?
I think the tariffs were intended, really aimed at forcing Russia's hand rather than India's hand. There were so many exemptions at the end of the day for pharmaceuticals and electronics, and they weren't going to be subject to these tariffs. It really was about stripping the oil revenue that Russia was enjoying, that was in part financing their war effort in Ukraine. That was really the target here. And to the extent that Trump has walked away from this summit making noises, at least, that some kind of a peace, a ceasefire is in the offing, I think that's not the case, but he might, then there's no need for the tariffs, because the tariffs weren't designed really to bring India into line in terms of trade relations. They were designed to cripple Russia's military more than anything else. Now, are there geoeconomic tensions and frictions between India and the United States? Yes, and there are between Canada and the United States and every other country in the world. But when I look at the big picture, India and the United States economically and geopolitically are going to draw increasingly close to one another over the next several years. Why? Because of China and China's expansionary policies in the Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, and vis-a-vis Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's also border disputes between India and China as well. The United States and India are natural security partners, if not treaty allies. And I think that's going to, if you'll pardon my use of the word, that's going to trump all other concerns and considerations in the medium term.
You know, you're absolutely right. And the entire conversation, Ambassador Dayal, were moving in that direction till the time President Trump spoke of the additional tariffs, because the initial 25% tariffs were seen as a position. Perhaps he's talking about 25% tariffs. When you negotiate, you may bring it down to 20, maybe 15% if you're lucky, the way, his treaty ally, Japan and South Korea, were being treated. But when this additional 25% conversation came, and when Secretary Treasury was warning India of still more tariffs, that seemed to indicate that that attitude was openly hostile. But what do you make of this comment that President Trump has made to American media, that maybe no need for additional tariffs to countries like India?
Well, the government of India will react to that, so I will not prejudge their reaction. Let me mention that I agree with the previous speaker that President Trump wants to reduce Russia's income from oil. But at the same time, there is no doubt that by saying that he would put additional 25% tariffs on India for purchasing Russian oil, he was pressurizing India. Yes. He has done everything possible to pressurize India, but I think our government has made it quite clear through its words and its actions and that it is not going to be pressurized like that. It will see where its interests lie and it will take action accordingly. So we are also not a dead economy, as President Trump likes to call us. Our tariffs are not obnoxious, as he says. We are a country that thinks through matters. We are the 5th largest economy, on way to becoming the 4th largest economy, and we can withstand pressure. But as I said earlier, his statements regarding India purchasing Russian oil and his intention to put 25% additional tariffs were no doubt intended to pressurize us.
Okay. Rohit, the buzz on ground on tariff and outcome, before I bring in Dr. Datta into that conversation. Okay, I believe we have Dr. Datta back with us. Rohit, stay with me for a moment. Dr. Datta, your take on his comments to the American media. As of now, perhaps, maybe, and that's the term he's used, maybe no additional tariffs on India. He's spoken of China, but he's also spoken of India.
Well, I think the 50% tariff on India itself was quite a lot. And I think that's the maximum which United States of America in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic scenario could have afford to do, and
no, but if I may, Dr. Datta, the additional tariff, is it beyond 50% in your impression, or this 25% tariff is there? The remaining 25% was to come later and not immediately.
Well, the additional 25% is supposed to come at the end of this month. That is the kind of a understanding which Washington had given.
Yes.
But the additional or the secondary tariff which he was talking about, I believe it was more of a hogwash and a kind of a rhetoric at the global level. And in reality, that would not have been feasible for United States of America. The comment which President Trump has given right now, saying that maybe there won't be any additional tariff on India, I think it is something like he's trying to build up the broken bridges as such. And in my understanding, it's little too late now, because ultimately in international relations there is no permanent friend, no permanent enemies. What matters is your permanent interest. Very soon, our foreign minister is going to travel to Russia. We will see a lot of things coming out of that meeting. The Chinese foreign minister is visiting India very soon. There
Yes.
would be a lot of permutation combinations emerging out of that meeting. What I understand is, like, United States of America, as history has proved in the past also, cannot be a reliable natural partner of India. US has proved this in the past, and US has once again proved it in no deeper words this time also. President Trump always used to proclaim that
Okay.
he's the biggest friend of India, but in reality, whatever he has done, I think no other president of US in the past has done that. So I think the bridges have been burnt too much, and it is something which is very difficult to repair.
So
It will
let me
take
bring in
another
Rohit
25
once
years
again
for
into this
US to bring
conversation.
back India.
Okay, Rohit, the conversation that is happening right now in the United States of America is more about Russia and the United States of America and, of course, Ukraine. So, are there those who say that the president tried, but now the ball is entirely in Ukraine's court? And when it comes to tariff, is this furious backpedaling by the United States of America? And what are your sources telling you? Now on the 25th, when the American team is supposed to come to India for the 6th round of talks, is that happening? Is there still on the cards?
So yes, the USTR has not indicated that they're pausing anything. They're going to be proceeding with traveling to India to continue negotiating with India on the trade deal. That's number one. The other thing about, I think President Trump, uh, honestly, in this case, is trying to use every leverage that he had, including putting those additional tariffs of India to bring a Russian president on the table to negotiate, which he's successfully done. As far as the ball going into Zelensky's court, look, I think it's also shifting some responsibility over to Zelensky. He's agreed with the Russians. He said that he talked about land. He also talked about NATO. So I think, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, yes, there could be a deal made, and he's not losing any territory. It's Zelensky who's going to lose territory. It's Ukraine. It's NATO. It's European Union. They are the ones with the highest stake into this war. So I think he's also putting them on the spot. He's
Okay.
also advised Zelensky to make a deal. So we'll have to wait and watch what second round becomes of it. Is it going to be one-on-one, or it could be trilateral, as suggested by President Trump?
And the indications are it could well be a trilateral, a bilateral between Russia and Ukraine, with the American president perhaps sitting in on that meeting as a guarantor of peace between the two countries. Will it be like that? We do not know, but that's just intense speculation in the world media right now. But I want a guest to stay with me as I play out two images on your television screen. One, you see this red carpet that's been rolled out for President Putin, and the other is the dressing down. Watch those images from the Oval Office when President Zelensky had visited the White House. Look at that stark difference in the manner in which America treated the two sides, President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin of Russia. Listen into that conversation that had taken place at the Oval Office in the White House that time. President Trump, President Zelensky, and J.D. Vance, Vice President, were there, and others. Listen in.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on
position
this
to
question.
dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this.
you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
You
We're
will-
going to feel very
You will
good.
feel influence.
We're going to feel very
I'm
good and
telling
very
you,
strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed
from the
yourself
very,
to be in a
from
very
the very
bad position,
beginning
and
of
he
the
happens
war.
to be right about
From the
it.
very beginning of the war.
You're not
Mr.
in a
Brown,
good position.
I
You don't
was
have the cards right now. With us, you start having
not playing
cards.
cards.
Right now, you don't.
I'm very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're
I'm
gambling
the
with the
president
lives
in
of
war.
millions of people.
You think
You're
you-
gambling with World War
What do you-
III.
what do you
You're
think about?
gambling with
What do you
World
think
War
about?
III. And
Yeah.
what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
I'm
That's
with
back
all
to you.
respect to your
Far
country.
more than a lot of people said
very
they
respect.
should have.
Professor Latham, your appreciation, your take on the difference in the treatment of President Zelensky then and President Putin now.
Well, to be charitable, there's certain lack of diplomacy at play in that February White House meeting on both sides. President Zelensky did not behave well, and nor did J.D. Vance, and nor did Donald Trump. And so it spiraled downwards into a very acrimonious, embarrassing moment on global television. Whereas, and I think, by the way, that happened almost by mistake. J.D. Vance kind of kicked it off, and then Zelensky reacted in a very counterproductive way, and then Trump jumped in with both feet, as he always does. Whereas this summit was more carefully scripted. And President Trump wanted a certain aura around this summit of positivity, of constructiveness, of forward motion, of him being buddies with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. He even used his first name on several occasions to kind of underscore that. So one spiraled out of control very, very quickly and created a negative vibe, and the other one was so carefully scripted that it left us with a largely positive vibe. When Donald Trump is self-disciplined and on his game, he can pull it off. When he's not self-disciplined, which I'm afraid is most of the time, things can get out of hand very, very quickly.
You know, there are so many lessons here for countries across the world, but Ambassador Dayal, one important lesson, one key takeaway is what Prime Minister Narendra Modi said from the ramparts of the Red Fort on the 79th Independence Day. Atmanirbhar Bharat in defense. You have to be self-reliant and self-sufficient on defense because that's the only way you're respected in the world.
Well, Prime Minister has repeatedly emphasized the importance of being self-reliant. In fact, Atmanirbharta is not a new theme where he is concerned. Right from the beginning, he has emphasized that because he has rightly understood that India's dependence on other countries is what makes us weaker. We have to stop depending on others as much as possible, and that will strengthen us. And he's doing everything possible, especially in the defense sector. And the latest conflict with Pakistan has shown that what we are manufacturing within India is extremely good quality, and it is an indication to the world that we are well on our way to becoming, as far as possible, self-reliant in defense matters. Now, let me just add one thing, that President Trump doesn't think that way. He thinks that India can be pressurized, and he has done everything possible. The great friendship, the strategic relationship that existed seems to have been destroyed by him. As an earlier panelist said, the bridges have been burnt, and it will be very difficult to restore that. And believe me, that will not be in America's interest at all, to have an India which is not inclined to be friendly.
Interesting, you should point that out. And is that also your take on this, Professor Latham? Do you also think that America has burnt all its bridges with India, especially in the manner in which President Trump described India as a dead economy and the Secretary of Treasury was then threatening India with additional sanctions? That's clearly no way to talk to a strategic partner, a comprehensive strategic partner with whom you want better relations, and especially for Indo-Pacific. Or has America walked away from that Indo-Pacific thinking because the White House has recently used the word Asia-Pacific and not Indo-Pacific?
Well, that's the older term that before the Pentagon invented this idea of the Indo-Pacific.
Yes.
But there are some parallels. The scale is different, but there are some parallels between the way in which President Trump treated Zelensky at that White House meeting and the way in which he's treated India today. Here's the lack of diplomacy. Let's just call it that to be charitable. Here's the difference. Ukraine is strategically, economically, and in every way conceivable irrelevant to American national interests, core American national interests. India is central to American core national interests in what I will always call the Indo-Pacific. And so I see this moment now as one of turbulence. I think we'll look back in 5 years and say, okay, the Americans lost their collective mind for 5 minutes. I don't think the bridges are burned forever. I don't think there's no way back from this. I think it's going to take, Trump's going to be gone in 2 years. His successor will have to not rebuild the bridges, but repair them, to be sure. But India and the United States share an interest in blunting China.
Yes.
And that is going to push them together, irrespective of their differences around trade and how they deal with the Russians, et cetera, et cetera. I'm absolutely convinced of that. This is a moment of turbulence. It could actually go pear-shaped in a really serious way, but I think cooler heads will prevail, are prevailing. And looking forward, I can only see a closer relationship between those two countries, the two most important democracies on the planet.
I completely agree with you on that. If cooler heads prevail, or if cooler heads is what America wants. India wants it for sure. All indications. There's nothing, Rohit, that, and Dr. Datta, so Rohit, you first and then Dr. Datta, nothing that would indicate that India upset the apple cart. India was trying to move forward very systematically to have that bilateral trade agreement quick off the block with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States of America, Piyush Goyal's repeated visits. Rohit, you've spoken to India's Commerce Minister and the team. So India was doing everything to build this relationship. But then the Americans, and right from the Joe Biden era, towards the end of the Joe Biden era, were kind of messing around with India. Trump has just taken it to next level, whether it's Bangladesh or Pakistan. Rohit.
Well, I think, in all sincerity and honesty, Gaurav, I think, when the Prime Minister was here in February, we had announced that we'll get a trade deal done by autumn,
Yes.
which is still, a month. We still have a month left. So I think we have stuck to, what we had promised to the Americans. I think it's the Americans who have said that they've gotten frustrated and, they don't like what we've offered, and they're talking about us, the red lines and whatnot, and so and so forth. But I think, as you said, and I think as the other panelists have said, I think if Trump, does not put those additional tariffs, we go back to 25%. And then if we could make some concessions, not in the sectors that we cannot, but if we could offer something else to the Americans, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump will take a trade deal with India and would want to restore a relationship with India. It's just a matter of time. He's thrown a geopolitical, conflict into the mix. He's never done that before with any other nation. So it's kind of surprising. But at the same time, it's Donald Trump we're dealing with. If Vladimir Putin could find a way back to the Americans, I'm pretty sure India can too.
Yes, but here he's dealing with a civilizational state with a collective memory that has seen America stab India in the back in the past. And I'm not even going back to the Kissinger-Nixon era, Dr. Datta, where the American had their 7th Fleet in the Indian Ocean region. We're only talking about 1998 Pokhran test, the sanctions that were imposed. And through the next step of strategic partnership and all the rebuilding of relationship, Trump just threw it out of the window. Was it Trump, or was the American deep state at play even at the end of the Biden era with what happened in Bangladesh, and with Trump it escalated with what's happening with Pakistan?
Well, exactly, Gaurav. In fact, I was thinking of coming into that itself. We need not go into the PL 480 program or the Nixon era.
Yes.
The sanctions which were imposed on India after Pokhran 2, after that it took almost around 20-25 years for India and United States of America to build, solidify the bridges and to repair the relationship and become natural ally. So that 20 years of hard work of American diplomats as well as American foreign policy thinkers, that has been watered completely, and it has gone down to drains because of the involvement of the deep state in relation to whatever happened in the coup in Bangladesh, and now in relation to Pakistan, and the short-temperedness of President Trump and the arrogance which he has. He thinks that he's the global super cop. That is something which has destroyed everything. Asia Pacific without India is immaterial. Even if one has to talk about Asia Pacific, it has to be Indo-Pacific. That is something which the United States of America has to realize, and US has to realize one very important thing, that our foreign policy is independent. No country can dictate its terms and conditions on Indian diplomacy as well as on Indian foreign policy matters. We do have issues with China, but then those
Okay.
issues are something which is not impossible to resolve, especially in relation to the border issue. We have a natural ally in Russia, and that is a historic natural ally of 80, 90 years, and we are not going to dump Russia for the sake of United States of America. The way
And especially when it
President
comes to
Trump has also
military,
behaved with NATO,
yes.
it is a reformentation and recombination of strategic relationship at the global level, and new alliances are emerging out of this whole fiasco.
Okay. Ambassador Dayal, the last couple of minutes that I have on this part of the show, how do you see do you see this as furious backpedaling by President Trump, or is this just a loose comment because he could just turn around and say something completely different tomorrow? The way US Treasury Secretary commented on additional tariffs on India, and the way India-Russia relations are those bridges completely burnt, or as Professor Latham points out, they would just be in need of repair?
Well, the bridges have been very severely damaged. I have spoken to a number of Indian policymakers, and people are upset about the manner in which President Trump has tried to undermine Indian interests. Let me say that while Professor Latham said that President Trump is only there for 2 years and the amount of damage he can do is limited, he will be there for 3.5 years.
Yes.
And his capacity to do damage is much greater than what anybody can envisage. Now, let me also mention that India has pursued a policy of multi-alignment. And we will continue to do so. If the United States wants to be friendly with us, we are more than willing to do that. But we are not going to be pressurized. President Trump has tried to pressurize us in a variety of ways. And let me also say that many people in India feel that he somehow has a wounded ego. He had said that he had brought about the ceasefire, but India was very categorical in pointing out that the ceasefire was negotiated between the DGMOs of the two sides, and that no other country had anything to do with it. His ego has been hurt, and he is taking it out. Look at what has happened vis-a-vis Pakistan. He had said Pakistan had given lies and deceit in return for the $33 billion that America had given to it. Now he's singing in a different tune about Pakistan. So the only thing which is consistent about President Trump is that he's inconsistent. And I don't know how seriously his statements can be taken.
Okay. President Latham, last 30 seconds, you want to comment on this, that there is a lot of hurt in India? Because when you're, of course, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent national interests in international geopolitics. But you don't expect a close strategic partner to do what America did. Will America do something to repair this? Or in your reading of Donald Trump, he'll just double down on whatever he's done, just trying to get a better Trump tariff deal, which may just then collapse?
Well, first, now we've had Lord Palmerston cited twice. That's unprecedented in my experience on television. Second of all, I really like, and I use it all the time in my thinking, this concept of multi-alignment. India has a long history of multi-alignment, but that's becoming a pervasive element of geopolitics in the 2020s. A lot of countries are adopting that multi-alignment. Sometimes they're on Team USA, sometimes they're on Team China, sometimes Team Russia. It just depends. Now, the problem there is that Trump is old enough, too old, but old enough that he still thinks in terms of blocks. The Soviet bloc versus the American bloc, the Russian bloc, and you have to be on one team entirely or the other team in his mind. And India is not playing that game, and he can't wrap his head around that. And the final point I'd make very, very briefly is the demographics in the United States are changing. The wealthiest demographic right now in the United States is the Indian diaspora. It has tended towards the Democratic Party for a long time. Initially under Trump, it was drifting towards the Republican Party. Now we don't know what the impact of Trump's clumsiness is on the geopolitical stage, how that's going to affect the domestic politics of the United States and perhaps push the diaspora, Indian diaspora, back a little bit more towards the Democratic Party, with obviously bad consequences for the Republican Party. So that's just something that I always throw in because it's very, very important in terms of American politics.
I will let that be the last word of this part of the show. To all my guests, many thanks for joining me.